The most debated and discussed section of the 14th Amendment actually was not Section 1, it was Section 2. At this time, there was no right to vote. The 15th Amendment, guaranteeing African American citizens the right to vote, at least African American men the right to vote, had not yet been enacted. After the Civil War, when the newly freed population is now represented in Congress, what does that mean for the South? It means the South gets more political power than it had before the Civil War. Why? Before the Civil War, there was the 3/5 clause, the so-called 3/5 compromise. Now, the 3/5 compromise was very bad, but not for the reason everybody thinks. It's not because they thought that African persons were somehow 3/5 of a person. On the contrary, the South wanted African persons, their enslaved persons, to be 5/5 of a person for purposes of this clause. Why? Because this clause meant that for every 5 enslaved persons in the South got 3 additional persons for purposes of representation in Congress. In other words, the 3/5 clause gave a 3/5 bump to representation in the South. In other words, what the 3/5 clause meant was, although enslaved persons couldn't vote in the South and had no political power in the South, their masters, their owners, got extra representation in Congress because of the 3/5 clause. For every 5 enslaved persons, that would count as if there were 3 additional white persons in the South. It gave them more representation. Well, after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, now enslaved persons, formerly enslaved persons, are 5/5. They're whole persons for purposes of representation. In other words, the South just fought the Civil War. They started the Civil War. They lost the Civil War. And now all of a sudden they get more representation in Congress, even though the newly freed men and women in the South still had no political power, still couldn't vote. That would be unthinkable. It would be unthinkable to give the South more political power as a result of the Civil War. Section 2 targets this problem. It says if you deny the right of the newly freed men and women to vote in the South, your proportion of representation in Congress is reduced proportionately to the number of those people that you exclude from the right to vote. In other words, it didn't guarantee the right to vote, but it did say if you deny the newly freed men in the South the right to vote, we will reduce your representation in Congress accordingly. Section 2 was never ultimately that important because the 15th Amendment effectively makes it irrelevant to the Constitution, because the 15th Amendment effectively guarantees the right of African American men to vote directly.